Let's talk about one of the most important concepts in debate strategy, the difference between offense and defense. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at one particular example in order to get at the bigger picture. First of all, let's say that we have a topic. The New York State government should reinstate the death penalty. And the first thing we're going to do with this topic is we're going to think about what the affirmative might say about it in its first speech. And just to make things really simple, we're going to imagine that the affirmative stands up, delivers one advantage, and then immediately sits down. And the one advantage that the affirmative delivers says that death penalty should be reinstated because that would lower the murder rate. And the argument here is basically deterrence. Death penalty makes criminals scared. Criminals don't want to get the death penalty, therefore they will not commit crimes such as murder that would lead to the death penalty if the death penalty were to be reinstated. So with this argument out of the way, let's think about how we can represent it graphically. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create an axis. And what this axis does is it represents the impact that the affirmative had introduced in this argument, the murder rate impact, which is why it has the title on top of the actual axis. On the left side of the axis, from this midpoint right here, all the way to the N, which stands for negative on the left, we have the negative side. This means that if we end up somewhere on the left side of the axis, it tells us that the negative is winning the murder rate impact. And on the right side, so anything to the right of this midpoint right here, we have the affirmative side. And this means that if we end up there, then the affirmative is winning the murder rate impact. And then right here in the middle, it tells us that this is basically a tie between the affirmative and the negative. And this particular impact is not going to determine who wins the round. Now that we have this axis set up, let's think about how we can represent the affirmative's argument on it. So the first thing that the affirmative does is it tells us that the murder rate impact is important. That by itself does not mean that the affirmative is winning on the murder rate impact. And so if the affirmative presents its impact first, this means that at the very start of the speech, we're starting out right here in the middle. We know the murder rate is going to be an important impact for the debate, but we don't really know which side is winning it yet. And the affirmative's goal is to take it from this midpoint right here toward the right. And that's exactly what it does with this deterrence argument. So we can draw an arrow representing the deterrence argument, taking us from that midpoint, from that neutral point, all the way to the very far right of this axis. Now that the affirmative has presented an argument, and now that we have graphed it, let's think about a couple of things that the negative can do in its first speech following this affirmative speech. So the first thing the negative can do is it can question the logic of deterrence by saying that some criminals are actually irrational. And if criminals are irrational, it means that they can't fully comprehend the notion that their crimes are going to have consequences to them. And so if those criminals can't really comprehend it, that means that they will not be deterred by death penalty or, to be honest, any other punishment. How can we graph that particular argument on the same axis? And the reason why we're going to graph it on the same axis is it still talks about the murder rate. So what matters and what differs from the affirmative is not the question of the impact, it's a question of where exactly on this axis we should be. Well, because this argument doesn't say that every single criminal is irrational, it means that there are still going to be some criminals who are going to be deterred by death penalty. However, not as much as the affirmative claims. And to represent this, we are going to start right here where the affirmative left off at the end of its speech, and we're going to move left, but perhaps we're not going to move all the way left. And so we're going to end up with an arrow that looks something like this. And we're going to number this arrow 1 because that's the arrow that represents that first argument. This particular sort of an argument is called mitigation. And the reason why it's called mitigation is because it's mitigating the affirmative's original impact. The affirmative said we're going to really lower the murder rate. And the negative comes here and says, well, you might lower the murder rate, but not nearly as much as you're claiming. Your impact is now mitigated. Let's think about a couple other arguments that the negative can make. So the second argument it could make is that if we look at the actual studies, according to a recent study done by several researchers at University of Colorado Boulder, 87% of experts in the field say that death penalty has no effect on murder rate one way or another. And if that's true, it means that nobody is really winning this impact, because the negative is not going to win this impact, because at the end of the day, it's not going to get any worse if we introduce death penalty, but the affirmative is not going to win this impact either. So the arrow for this is going to look something like this, right? We're still starting where the affirmative left off, but this time we're actually going further than what we did with the mitigation argument. Now we're returning exactly to the midpoint where the affirmative started. This particular kind of argument is called terminal defense. And the reason why it's called terminal is because it is the farthest that defense can go. Terminal means going to the very end. And the farthest that we can go here is bringing this argument back to the midpoint. Now, some debaters would tell you that there is no such thing in debate as terminal defense, and their logic would go something like this. They would say, well, 87% of experts say that death penalty has no effect on the murder rate, but that still means that there are 13% of experts who think that it might have at least a little bit of an effect. And if that's true, there is at least some probability that the affirmative's argument is true. There is at least some probability that this arrow going to the right might happen, which means that if we reinstate the death penalty, the worst thing that would happen is nothing happens, but the best thing that could happen is that there's actually a chance that murder rate would go down. And so if there is a chance that something good would happen and there is no chance of anything bad happening to offset that, then the affirmative wins by default. That logic only works if the affirmative makes that response, however, and so in the absence of that response, if the negative makes this argument and the affirmative just drops it entirely in its next speech, then we are left right here in the middle, and the judge can't really use the murder rate impact to determine who wins the round, and the judge has to look elsewhere on their flow. Let's think about another argument that the negative can make. The negative could say that actually, death penalty creates the message in society that life doesn't matter, that the right to life is not an absolute right, and people who look at this message are actually going to be more likely to commit murder. And in fact, there is probably some empirical evidence to back up this hypothesis, because if we look at states that have death penalty, they actually have higher murder rates than the states that don't have death penalty. The arrow for this argument would look something like this. So once again, we're starting where the affirmative left off. But what we're doing is we're not just trying to mitigate this. We're not even trying to bring this to the middle point. We're saying that the murder rate is an impact that actually is benefiting the negative. In other words, we're taking the affirmative's original impact of the murder rate and we're turning it around against the affirmative. This particular turn is called a link turn because it agrees with the impact of murder rate being bad, but it tries to turn that impact around and use it against the affirmative. It's trying to link into that impact. An impact turn, on the other hand, would say that the murder is actually a good thing, and in this case, probably not a particularly applicable argument. And very appropriately, this particular strategy is called a turn. A turn is essentially a response which doesn't just take out the logic of the other side, but actually tries to use that logic against that side. Now let's talk about a fourth argument. This is going to be particularly interesting. And the fourth argument that the negative can make is that death penalty is a bad thing because it brings with itself a lot of legal costs. A lot of people think that it's a lot more expensive to keep a person in prison for life but statistically speaking, it's actually more expensive to go through with the death penalty because the cost of lawyers, the cost of judges, just the cost of all that paperwork piles up so much that it's actually just cheaper to keep the person in prison. Let's think about how we can represent that argument graphically. That's actually going to be very difficult because cost has nothing to do with the murder rate. Actually, this is not really a response to the affirmative's original argument, because the affirmative said that the murder rate is going to go down, and it might be true that the murder rate would go down, and it might also simultaneously be true that death penalty is bad because of all the costs that pile up because you have to pay lawyers, judges, and other people who work in the judicial system. So the argument is not necessarily bad. This argument is a perfectly legitimate thing that the negative should bring up. It's just not a response. And because it's not a response, we cannot put it on this axis because remember, the title of the axis is the murder rate, and legal costs have nothing to do with the murder rate. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to draw an entirely new axis, and we're going to title that axis cost. And of course, just like with any other axis, we always start here in the middle, and once the negative makes its arguments about cost, it's going to draw an arrow that's going to push the argument toward the left, toward the negative side. And we're going to say that this arrow is number 4. And this particular argument, this particular strategy, is called a disadvantage. So in the same way that this was an advantage of the death penalty when we talked about the affirmative's original argument, now the negative is saying, okay, you might be right, there might be some advantages here, but what about this disadvantage? This can also be for short called a disad. That's the most common name. Sometimes people call it a DA. And a more general term for this is that a disad is a sort of an off case, because whereas all these arguments, mitigation, terminal defense, turn, these are all on case arguments. They are on the affirmative case. Disad is off the affirmative case, and therefore we can call it an off case. So now that we have all 4 of these arguments, let's go back to the title of this topic and let's talk about offense and defense. Well, the first 2 of the arguments that we've learned, mitigation and terminal defense, well, you could have guessed terminal defense from the title, those are both defense. And there is a very easy way to know this. Defense is something that simply leaves us on the affirmative side of the axis, or at best brings us back to the middle. In other words, defense tries to push back against the affirmative's argument, but it doesn't try to actively win the impact for the negative. Winning the impact for the negative would be the job of offense. And you might notice that we can have an offensive answer. That's really all a turn is. It is a direct answer, which also happens to be offense. Or you can bring up an entirely new impact. For example, in this case, we can talk about cost. And you can make that a disadvantage offense, which is not an answer. Now let's take a look back. Let's take a step back and let's think about which of these approaches is better. Do you want to have offense or do you want to have defense? And the basic answer here is that you simply cannot win the round if you only run defense. Think about what would happen if somebody came at you with a stick and tried to hit you on the head. If they hit you on the head, clearly they're winning in the fight. You might try to block their stick so that it would hit your arm instead of your head. And this is clearly a good thing to do because if it hits your arm, it would hurt a lot less. Nonetheless, if they hit your arm, you are the one who is in pain. They are not the one who are in pain. And therefore, you're still losing the fight. You're just not losing as badly as you would have been if they actually managed to hit your head. Another analogy to think about is sports. Once again, in sports, offense is trying to score a goal. Defense is trying to prevent another team from scoring a goal. You simply cannot win the game if you concentrate your entire effort on defense, because that means that you will never, ever, ever score a goal, and the opposing team has at least a shot of getting around your defense no matter how good it is, and at least a chance that it would score its goal. That being said, defense does have its place in debate. For example, let's think about a strategy in which we have argument number one, the argument that some criminals are irrational, that significantly mitigates the affirmative's offense from its advantage, and then we combine that with a disadvantage that gives the negative independent offense. If the negative runs both of those arguments, then it could argue that the cost argument would outweigh the murder rate argument, because the murder rate argument has significant mitigation, whereas the cost, if the affirmative fails to answer that, stands entirely unanswered and therefore should be preferred by the judge. The last thing and the last thought that I want to end here with is to say that in this particular example, I presented the negative as the one that's making all these arguments, but you can think of the affirmative as using all four of these strategies as well. You can think, for example, what would happen if the negative came up with the argument of cost, and then the affirmative could say, mitigation, no, this might not cost as much as you think. The affirmative can say terminal defense, saying actually no, death penalty and life in prison would cost exactly the same. The affirmative can try to turn the cost and say, although this would be factually incorrect, but the affirmative could still try to say that death penalty would actually be cheaper than the alternatives. Or the affirmative could say that the cost argument doesn't matter because, well, in this case it wouldn't be the disadvantages, but in this case it would be the advantages, because the affirmative advantages, such as the original murder rate argument, should be outweighing.